Thank you for joining us today for this presentation on the Fantasy Bond. This presentation comes to you from the Glennon Association and PsychAlive.
Sometimes it takes the form of a strong, over-dependent type of relationship, or a kind of interconnectedness where one is dominant, one is submissive, and these patterns persist powerfully.
I'd like to start our presentation today by defining the fantasy bond. The fantasy bond is an illusion of connection, originally an imaginary fusion or joining with the mother. As we're using it here to describe both the original imaginary connection formed during childhood and also our repetitive efforts as adults to continue to make connections in our intimate relationships, often very much replaying the connection we had as a child. So if we had a mother who maybe didn't pay very much attention to us and we felt hurt, we may also form a relationship as an adult with a partner who doesn't pay attention to us, and we recreate that old hurt.
They lose themselves in this type of making this type of connection. There's a certain need to control the other, to maintain the illusion, and in that they lose themselves to some extent.
In a relationship that's characterized by fantasy bond, there's a lot of overstepping of each other's boundaries, speaking for the other person. We do this, we like this, saying how the other person feels, answering for the other person, which shows a real lack of respect for the other person's boundaries, and also only seeing the other person in relation to ourselves and how they're meeting our needs and not really having respect for them as a separate person. They become like our right arm, but then we're no more attracted to them than we are to our right arm, and we don't feel very much about them. And we only feel devastated if the relationship breaks up. Then we feel like we lost our other half and we're not a whole person anymore. But we lose respect for them.
So how do we get stuck in a fantasy bond? First of all, we tend to idealize our parents and our family. And in that, we hold on to seeing their negative qualities in others. We also tend to hold on to our own negative self-image, the image we formed in the family that may be negative, and so therefore we don't accept love or can't believe love from new people in our lives. And we tend to project the negative qualities that our parents had onto our new relationship partners. So if we had a mother or father that was indifferent to us, we may replay that same pattern in our romantic relationship.
When people are threatened, they fragment into both a parental element, a critical parent, and an infantile child element. And so they act out different aspects of those points of view. And they tend to act out one or the other part in their relationships.
So how do we spot that we're in a fantasy bond? What are some manifestations that indicate that we're in a fantasy bond? The first is withholding. We often tend to start to withhold characteristics, particularly the ones that our partner valued the most about us. So if they love talking to us late into the night, we no longer have time for that. We also tend to either idealize our partner or denigrate them, to see them more in terms of people in our past. But if we may idealize them if we want to be taken care of by them and actually be angry at them for showing any human weaknesses or foibles, or we may put them down or see them in a more negative light because we can't believe somebody who has really positive characteristics would really choose or care about somebody like us when we're holding on to our old negative self-image. Also, we tend to hold on to the form of a relationship but give up the substance. So we may still be spending time together, but we're not really relating anymore. We may be each on our own devices. We may care very much about the Saturday night date, but when we're on that date, it may not be a real close or personal time where we're really making contact with the other person. So we're now in the form of the relationship, but the substance is gone. Also, partners tend to lose their independence. They tend to feel chained to one another, like they have to report to one another, like they have to check in. So now that things that they used to love to do become something that they have to do. And they give up the things they independently like to do and cared about and that really lit them up. So instead of expanding our world, if we're shrinking our world in a relationship, that might be a sign that we're in a fantasy bond. Also, we tend to polarize, where one person becomes the parent in different aspects of the relationship and the other person plays the child. Or we may play the child in other aspects where the other person becomes the parent. So we're playing out parent and child rather than two equal adults coming together who really care about each other.
The more they depend on the relationship for security, give up their original identity, and make that connection with each other, the more they give up the real substance of the relationship for the form and the fantasy. And so gradually over time, they replace what real relating with a fantasy of closeness.
At some point when we get threatened in the relationship, we form a fantasy bond with our partner, not unlike the one we formed originally with our parent, where we're fantasizing about the person, but we're not really acting in a way that's close to them anymore. And what it does is it gives us a sense of connection to another person so we don't feel so isolated and alone. And yet it keeps a certain emotional distance between us and our partner. And a lot of the behaviors that we engage in when we have a fantasy bond create a certain emotional distance in the relationship. We don't let the person get too far away. We keep this fantasy of being fused with them, but we don't really get too close either.
There's a sense of security and safety, but you pay a great price in terms of real relating and real substance in the relationship.
I'd like to end this presentation by sharing with you our resources. We have a number of videotapes on relationships and on the fantasy bond in particular, and we have a number of books we've written as well which cover topics that have to do with relationships, including The Fear of Intimacy, Sex and Love and Interpersonal Relationships, and the fantasy bond. The next slide will show you, will give you a direct link to our websites, Glendon Association and PsychAlive, where you can find these materials. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation.